a magnificent jewel, an unsolvable crime, and a doctor, a detective, and a lawyer. All of this and more is contained in the story of the Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. This story was written in the early 19th century, and the story is set in the same time period in which it was written. When analyzing this crime, justice is an ever-present companion, and it appears in all aspects of this story. The theme of justice is threaded throughout the entire book, either through the application of justice or the lack thereof. Justice in the Moonstone is directly connected to the protagonist, Mr. Franklin Blake, at every step of the story. Starting with his help in the proceedings to the eventual discovery of the thief, Franklin is always at the forefront of the action. The author, Wilkie Collins, was an influential and well-known author in his day, who only recently has become more well-known. He was a prolific author and wrote numerous works of both fact and fiction. Quote, during his lifetime, however, he wrote over 30 major books, well over 100 articles, short stories, and essays, and a dozen or more plays, end quote. He had many friendships with other writers, one of the most notable of these being with Charles Dickens. This is an image of one of the many letters that Dickens wrote to Collins. Collins went to school for 6 years in his youth, including a 2-year interruption in which he went traveling with his family. This travel closely relates to Franklin's travels mentioned in the beginning of The Moonstone, which influenced the character development of this character throughout the novel. He was apprenticed to tea merchants after school, and then went on to learn law, but employed neither of these skills in any measure during his life. During his later years, he started suffering from multiple conditions and injuries, and resorted to the use of opium as a painkiller. He ended up dying from a stroke in the summer of 1889, yet his works continued to be popular long after his death. The novel opens with an aging servant, Gabriel Betteridge, reading from a book, Robinson Crusoe, from which he religiously applies its instruction to his daily life. Mr. Franklin Blake, who is the closest character to a protagonist in this story, requests that Gabriel dictate his account of events surrounding the theft of the Moonstone. Eventually, the reader learns that Franklin asked this of all the key characters involved in the mystery of the Moonstone. Betteridge's account fills the first 2/3 of the novel and tells of the crime, the attempt to solve the mystery by Sergeant Cuff, and the resulting confusion concerning all involved. The narrative begins with Gabriel waiting for Franklin at the Verinder summer house in Yorkshire. When Franklin arrives, he presents Rachel Verinder with the Moonstone, and everyone is amazed at the magnificence of the diamond. That night, everyone goes to bed in their separate rooms, and Rachel places the Moonstone in a special cabinet that has no way to be locked. When everyone awakens in the morning, it is discovered that the Moonstone has disappeared. Franklin heads the detective work, along with Gabriel and the celebrated Detective Cuff. After numerous hours trying to solve the mystery and putting all of the various facts together, the 3 men are utterly flummoxed by the absence of evidence. This results in everyone proceeding with their daily lives, and eventually, the Moonstone fades into the recesses of their memories. After some time, Franklin returns to the topic of the Moonstone with Gabriel and confronts Rachel to gather additional facts. Rachel says that Franklin was, in fact, the one who stole the diamond, because she saw him steal it with her own eyes. This, in addition to learning that a certain piece of clothing, key to the investigation, was actually owned by Franklin, adds to the irrefutable evidence against him. After a conversation with the doctor's assistant, a unique experiment, and verbal affirmation from a banker, the discovery is made that Franklin did, in fact, take the Moonstone, but he took it under the influence of opium. One of the reasons that opium was included in this story was that the author, Wilkie Collins, had a major addiction to opium and so would easily know its effects. Collins' health began to decline during the 1850s and 1860s, suffering what he always described as rheumatic gout or neuralgia. Ultimately, Beard, his doctor, prescribed opium, but always for purely medical reasons. Over the years, Collins developed an enormous tolerance and eventually took daily more laudanum than would have sufficed to kill a ship's crew or company of soldiers. This influence of opium in Collins' life probably gave him inspiration for the Moonstone's major plot point. When Franklin is caught by Rachel in her bedroom, he is directly under the influence of opium, after the doctor subtly gave it to him through one of the guests at the party. Even though all signs point toward Franklin's guilt, the reality is that the least suspected person, Godfrey, the same person who gave Franklin the opium, is in fact the guilty party. On Rachel's birthday, the topic of the moonstone had been constantly on Franklin's mind. He had also abstained from cigars for the past few days, after Rachel had told him that she detested the smell. He had then argued with the doctor during dinner on the efficiency of modern medicine. All of these factors resulted in Franklin unknowingly ingesting opium, stealing the moonstone while under the influence, thinking that he was protecting it, and eventually giving it to Godfrey after returning to his room. At that time, Godfrey had been in need of a large sum of money, and he had needed it before the week was over. When Franklin had presented him with the moonstone, Franklin had unwittingly provided the most opportune circumstance possible for Godfrey, and so Godfrey set off to sell the moonstone for money. When Franklin had awakened in the morning, he had lost all memory of the events during the night and decided to head the investigation into the robbery. The story arc in The Moonstone is similar to an arc in Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. Jean Valjean is a common thief in the beginning of this novel, and later redeems himself from the crimes he had committed, although he never faced a full sentence for his crimes. His accuser, Javert, a policeman, shadows Jean throughout his entire life. Javert is spared by Jean Valjean when Jean had a chance to kill Javert and thus save his own life. Instead, Valjean's morals convinced him to let Javert go, and thus Javert is indebted to Valjean. Later in the story, Jean Valjean is caught by Javert, yet only requests two things from the policeman: that he could save Marius, who is on the brink of death, and that he could have one last look at his home. Javert, without saying so aloud, grants both these meager last actions. In the end, he lets Jean go free. They reach number 7. Jean Valjean rapped. The door opened. "Very well," said Javert. "Go up. I will wait here for you." On reaching the first story, he paused. Jean Valjean, either to take a breath or mechanically, looked out of this window. Jean Valjean was bewildered with amazement. There was nobody there. Javert was gone. Javert spares Jean Valjean from the arrest and punishment that he deserved because he believed that it would be a direct conflict of his morals to arrest a man who had spared his life. In a similar way, Rachel declines to give Franklin to the authorities, first because it would be against her morals to give up someone she loves, and afterward to give up one who had committed a crime unwillingly. Justice in every case should be completely and utterly unbiased and disconnected from the crime or problem. Those who judge a case should be randomly selected and then whittled down to the most unbiased group possible. This is the process of a fair trial in reality. In the case of non-criminal justice, the mediator should still be disconnected from the case, or else they would not be able to mediate between the two or more parties. The first of the opposing parties, in the case of the Moonstone, would be Miss Rachel Verinder, the owner and victim of the theft of the Moonstone. The second would be Mr. Franklin Blake, the primary suspect in the case of the stolen Moonstone. The case being that Rachel accuses Franklin of stealing the Moonstone from her possession, having seen him perform the deed itself in front of her the same night the jewel disappeared. Franklin's defense is that he had no memory of stealing the Moonstone and states that it was in fact not him at all. At this point, the reader, by nature of being human, has to choose a side in the story. Has Rachel been lying about witnessing Franklin, or has Franklin been presenting a false defense? Could both of them be telling the truth? In the end, the reader discovers that both of them were indeed telling the truth, yet some overlooked details, particularly the use of opium, help to give the story its enjoyable ending. Although Franklin Blake still committed this crime, the punishment for the said crime was not pursued for the sake of Rachel's conscience. Justice resounds throughout the story of the Moonstone, whether it is the application or the absence thereof. The use of opium directly reflects Wilkie Collins' own experience with the useful and addictive drug, and directly produced the dilemma that Rachel faced in the novel. The masterpiece that is Les Miserables also includes a similar experience related to justice and their interaction between Javert and Jean Valjean concerning punishment for a crime. The theme of justice in the story of the Moonstone causes one to consider major questions concerning morals and what to do in a situation when each decision might not be the right one. With the introduction of difficult philosophical questions into an intricate story, Wilkie Collins created a masterpiece that will be a classic for years to come.